So I had a thought about how I guess this might provide just like a little bit of insight into my movement from atheist to New Age to Christianity. And what it ended up being was what really sparked my perspective shift was that I realized that for my entire life I had acknowledged in pretty much every debate that the idea of a God was theoretically possible, but I just did not think that it was correct. And I just left it there, pretty much. And I never actually made a strong effort to try and determine that. Like, how do I put this? I used this scientific method. I was looking out in the world at worldly things in order to determine what, in order to determine my position about that. And at the end of the day, worldly things mean nothing. So I was very short-sighted at first. I focused on basically what I had basically what I read from a whole bunch of scientists and what I read from people who had read about scientists and things like that. And I just kind of never really questioned anything because I just assumed that they knew what they were talking about. And to a certain degree, I believe that they do know what they're talking about when it comes to worldly things. However, I was not acknowledging the fact that if, as I acknowledged was hypothetically possible, there is a God, then there are spiritual things, by definition, which are also, as the honest atheist acknowledges, theoretically possible. Now, I was basically thinking inside of a box, all the walls and everything like that. And what finally happened was I decided to break down those walls. I had traumatic experiences. I kind of hit like rock bottom spiritually where I had attempted suicide, and I'm not going to get into that particularly too much at the moment, but I was in a bad place in my life. And what I ended up actually doing was I realized that I had something about the world just was not enough for me, and just the way that I was living my life was not enough. And it wasn't something about what was outside of me that was the problem. It was something about the way that I was and the way that I interacted and viewed the world in here. And so what I ended up doing is I essentially broke down everything about my fundamental beliefs. I shattered it into dust. I made a conscious effort to do so, and made a conscious effort to change my perspective from a totally, essentially ruined standpoint where I had no preconceived notions. And my preconceived notions, I just threw them out the freaking window, and I looked not outward at worldly or physical things, but I started to look inward for spiritual things. I tried to broaden my horizons. Now, it turned out I was looking in the wrong direction at first, but what I really needed was to actually have my preconceptions broken down and to unshackle myself, because they were a box, they were a cage, and they were a prison. But I had built it myself, and I had the key. I finally unlocked the doors, but what I did not realize, and this took me another year or so to realize, was that I had essentially opened the first box to find myself in a much bigger box. And there were several times when I had actually started essentially pushing outside of that box too. But I was afraid of what I was finding by the idea of pushing outside of that, or essentially pushing past that box. Because that box essentially led to God, and that scared me. And it made sense, especially because every time I basically started to peek out past that box, and I'm speaking spiritually at this point, because these walls were not outward, they were walls within. And as I kept continually breaking down walls and breaking down walls and breaking down walls, and I was afraid of what I was going to find, but I kept breaking them down. And when I eventually went through the last door, I found God there. And there were many occasions, and he did not like my spiritual practices in a lot of ways. And I could tell that, and it scared the crap out of me, like nobody's business. And so every time that I did that, at first I would retreat, and then I would like block that off from my memory. And I mean, every time I went back and did it again, it would be familiar, and I would remember that I had done it before and before, and I had always run from it. And eventually it occurred to me that I was just putting myself in a smaller box again. I was still trapped within the box, but I had the illusion of being free. Like in, if I'm to use an analogy, in the Matrix trilogy, they get out of the Matrix, but then you find out suddenly that Neo is still able to use his abilities in the quote-unquote real world. Well, then you find out that it wasn't quite the real world, like you hadn't quite gone far enough after all, or at least that's what I took from that, and that there was another level. Well, when eventually I looked past that door, and as I was about to turn back again in fear, it finally occurred to me that you can't run from the truth and expect to know it. Because I had been constantly gaining knowledge, but never actually being able to come to the truth of what I had been finding. Because I was too afraid to walk through that last door and stay walking, and just like having kept myself walked through that door. And so eventually I basically got my strength together spiritually, and I walked through that door. I broke down the walls, and I went all the way outside the box again, which led me spiritually to God completely. Now, I'm not sure if this is actually something that can be, I mean, I'm sure pretty much any atheist who watches this video is probably going to just totally dismiss it, but I'd like to think that some people who are going through a place where I was, would be able to look at this and understand it the way that I mean it to be understood, and understand what I'm actually describing to you. Anyway, I just want to say God bless you all. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I would really like to know what you think about this video. And you have a great night.